What's up, everybody? Welcome to another installment of That Science and Nature Show. I'm your host, Jeremy Howard, and joining me for this episode, we have Sebastian.
Hello.
And Becky.
How's it going?
So this is our first, what I'm referring to as summer specials, since we're not in Umsel Radio. Umsel Radio is currently closed for the summer. Apparently, I found out from the technical director, the radio is actually having a lot of technical issues that they're fixing for now until the fall.
I feel like we kind of knew that.
Well, yeah. I'm telling the listener this because they're not hearing this right now. They're hearing this as a podcast.
Maybe we should start over without an admission.
No, it was funny because I haven't heard that either. Like, no one's told me.
Okay. Well, yeah, now you know. They're fixing the radio. The radio is currently broken. So anyway, we're recording this as a podcast now, not as a live radio show for the summer. But we're doing roughly an episode a month. And this episode is going to be all about pollinators. So June houses what's referred to as National Pollinator Week, which is this annual celebration that focuses on the significance of pollinators, their health overall, and how we can ultimately protect them for future generations. The week kind of houses a lot of types of awareness events, like festivals, educational outreach, things of that nature. It's a mix of conservation focus, but also a lot of celebratory celebrations, kind of highlighting how awesome and cool pollinators are, because a lot of people don't know about them. So for the hour, we're going to be talking about, or however long we record for this, talking all about pollinators and our exposure with them, our experience with them, talk about our research a little bit, talk about myths with pollinators. What do people kind of get wrong about them? What do they get right about them? And then talk about ways that we can kind of promote pollinator health, kind of get involved in the community for National Pollinator Week. This is being recorded on June 3rd, so at the beginning of June, but National Pollinator Week is June 19th through 25th this year. So it's a few weeks away. I'll be posting this much closer to that when it goes up online. But I want to start out just talking about pollination biology and all about that. So as a general question, since I've been talking for a while, for the audience, what is pollination? What's a pollinator?
Well, I'll say, as pretty much everything in biology, there's a few exceptions, but everything needs to, exchange genes with each other. And, for most higher animals, they do that through sexual reproduction, which is, what we do and also what plants do. But plants have the unique problem of not being able to move and find other partners to exchange genes with. So a good deal of plants, actually a significant majority of all plants, have a relationship with insects. That the insects actually help carry genes from one plant to another.
That was the most PG explanation of sexual reproduction I've heard. Exchange genes with one another. Yes, the pollination is about the reproduction of plants.
Yes.
Maybe worth backing up. So the pollen is going to be the male gamete with sperm inside. And I'm worried as a non-plant biologist, I'm going to say all that wrong because it's been years, but just letting people...
Go ahead.
Sebastian's here. We're fine.
Letting people know that the pollen moving around is actually the sperm getting moved around for the different plants.
Mm-hmm. And the eggs, just like animals have ovaries, instead of that, plants have their little eggs just inside of the female flower, the flower that actually receives the pollen, that contains the eggs. And when the pollen is transferred to the flower, then it's fertilized, and the plant can combine those two in the ovaries and make the seed. So that's it.
So as listeners, you're not here with us, but we happen to have some technical production help today who's also really good at plants, but doesn't have a microphone, so I'm feeling super self-conscious.
Special shout out to Ray Cannonberg for being awesome and bringing us podcast recording equipment, because we do not possess this ourselves.
And not throwing things at us when we say things about plants.
Yes.
So
You'll have your chance someday.
So what is a pollinator? That's a very broad term. Who or what is a pollinator?
I'd say anything that's moving that pollen from plant to plant. I mean, I guess you could have some arguments about can some plants are wind pollinated, so would we call wind a pollinator? I mean, usually with pollinator, I'm thinking of an organism.
Yeah, what kinds of organisms are we talking about?
Oh.
This is a contentious subject.
Oh, is it?
Yeah.
On the National Pollinator Guide, I have a bunch of lists listed right here, so I'm just curious if you're going to tell me them or not.
There are. I will say the difference between there is pollinators, and then there are effective pollinators, and there are, as a pollination lab, we tend to throw some shade at things that are listed as pollinators but are known as like really kind of bad pollinators, or like
sorry monarch butterflies.
Yes, butterflies take a big part of that shade because they're so spindly and they're so like precise with their little tongues that they do not transfer that much pollen, even though they are pollinators. There are also bees, hummingbirds, beetles. Our lab studies bats as pollinators, which is not something that happens very often in North America. There's the only pollinating bats in North America are ones that go to the like giant cacti in the Southwest. But as you go into Central and South America, that becomes a lot more popular.
And we've also got flies.
Yes.
And then there's a few kind of funny critters that do it accidentally, some mammals. And I remember we had a debate about a frog in our seminar class that might have been doing some of that. And then there's some lizards.
Yep, there are some lizards.
And have we talked about the big one yet? The bees
Yeah,
and the wasps
Yes. Yeah.
and the ants.
You're the bee person. give an intro on bee. Also, you are also
I am
a
also
bee
bee
person.
person.
He's
Thank
bee
you for
person.
neglecting
Sorry.
me.
Sebastian is plant and bat person.
Yes.
So right now I'm looking at the official Pollinator Week Toolkit, which is a document put on by the Pollinator Partnership. If you go to www.pollinator.org, you can find a packet which has a lot of activities and background info about Pollinator Week. I'll be referring to it a couple times throughout the episode. But in terms of the official synopsis they give, again, this is for general audience that may not know as much about pollination. The pollinators they list are bees, birds, butterflies, bats, beetles, moths, wasps, and flies. So I think we hit most of them that we're talking about, minus like the frog and the lizard. Those are kind of a cool, unique example. But usually the wings and things are kind of the pollinators, more or less.
Everything with wings tends to be a dramatically better pollinator than things without wings because, there are examples of pollinating geckos and things like that, and we typically think of the effectiveness of a pollinator as how far does it go to get to the next plant. So if the gecko lives in that tree and only pollinates other flowers of that tree, then it's not actually pollinating the plant. So there's also
that gets into that is so some plants do self-pollinate, but there's this idea in evolutionary ecology that could lead to a dead end. You don't have enough genetic diversity to persist on evolutionary timescales. But
But yes, pollination is very important from pollinators because ultimately, without the pollinators, all the plants would most likely die. Not all of them, but a lot of them would die.
It's like 85-90% of all plant species are just pollinated versus wind or things like that.
which things are wind pollinated? Is it like grasses and evergreen kind of trees?
Yep, exactly. Those are definitely the biggest groups are grasses, which are, I believe, almost exclusively. There's probably exceptions knowing botany. I'm sure there's a few weird grasses, but every grass I can think of, wind pollinated, not all of the gymnosperms, which are things that have cones, but most cone plants like pine trees and whatnot, they're wind pollinated too. Couple exceptions, but yeah, those are the big groups.
So when did we individually, when did we start learning about getting to know about pollinators ourselves? Because I feel like I maybe later at the party, I feel like I was much more aware of it maybe after college. I mean, vaguely I was aware the bumblebee takes the pollen from the flower and delivers it to the other flower, but from high school biology. But in terms of understanding the significance of it, I was definitely not aware of it until much, much later.
I'll say as a weird plant nerd, basically from the beginning of my sentience, my whole life has kind of been plant adjacent. So as a little 10-year-old
came out of the womb already knew about pollination biology.
as a weird little gardening nerd at like 8 or 10 years old, I was like cross pollinating stuff. So I'm a weird example of that.
Okay.
That goes back a while. But as far as being in scientific pollinator research, that's come with getting into this program.
Okay. How about you, Becky?
For me, it probably started during my master's research because we had a professor there that was a bee and alpine plant guy. I think it was Delphinium was the group he worked with. So when I took evolutionary ecology, we ended up with all these pollinator examples. So that was an example of a co-evolving system that just came up a lot in my education, even though I didn't study them. And then when I started working for museums, I got into citizen science with monarchs. And even though they're crummy pollinators, they do make a really great conservation species because if we save their habitat, we are saving other pollinators as well. And then as I've gotten older, I've gotten into native plant gardening. And now in my PhD program, I study bumblebees. So I've had to learn a lot more to work with the bees. And yeah, it's been pretty cool.
Being surrounded by like more than a dozen other people who mostly just talk about pollinator stuff will really increase the amount of pollinator information you're exposed to. Being in this department really helps for that.
Yes, indeed. Broadly speaking, what is our research related, or what is our research about in relation to pollination for each of us? I can start. Start me. So I research bumblebees, and I'm really interested in figuring out where bees go. So ultimately, like, how do they navigate in their space? That's sort of the sexy term for it. Basically, bees don't have smartphones. How do they know to get from point A, being the nest, to point B, the flower, and what kinds of things impact how they're going to get there? Obviously, if the bee can't find the flower, or if it can find the flower but it can't get back to its colony to help it survive by bringing their goods, the nectar and pollen back, and the colony dies, it's basically for nothing if the bee can't figure out how to get back. So in a broad sense, that's what I'm interested in research-wise.
All right. My lab deals a lot with these bat-pollinated plants from Central and South America called Burmeistera. Unless you've been to Central or South America, you probably never have seen this weird plant. The flowers kind of look like a little cuttlefish with their petals pointed down. They're absolutely bizarre looking, and they're really weird and cool plants. And they're mostly pollinated by bats, but a couple of them have shifted to hummingbirds. And that's kind of what I'll be looking into, the floral traits that relate to that. And Still ironing out the details as to exactly what I'll be doing. But
Cool.
Something related to these guys and bats.
So I give bees drugs. That's what I'm interested in. So when we think of nectar, we usually think of sugar water. And that is the big component of nectar, getting calories, getting sweet stuff. But plants produce all these secondary metabolites, or what we call them, or other things that are in the nectar. And sometimes those are psychoactive chemicals. And as humans, we know this. Many of the psychoactive chemicals that we use medicinally, recreationally, those are all coming from plants. And more recently, we're starting to figure out that some of these things are in nectar. So specifically, I'm interested in caffeine because it's easy to work with, it's legal to work with, all that good stuff. So coffee plants and citrus plants will produce caffeine in their nectar. We suspect that there's a lot more plants, but no one's been systemically collecting nectar and looking for it. My big research is I want to know what bees learn about these psychoactive drugs. Do they know that they make them feel a certain way, or does something like caffeine, which suppresses appetite in people, maybe it gives bees a version of the bee munchies, so they visit flowers more often. So I'm really interested in how bees learn about and how bees are affected by psychoactive chemicals. Because if you're a plant, if you can get a bee to come visit your flowers by producing a drug that takes way less energy than making your nectar more sugary, that might be a good way to go. There's also some really cool research on bee consciousness and what do they know and how do they feel and that kind of stuff. So bees on drugs.
Wonderful.
Nice. I like the sales pitch for that. All right. So we talked a little bit about what we know about pollinators, or our relationship to pollinators and our research. So I want to talk a little bit now about some myths and misconceptions about pollinators, because obviously the three of us, we study pollinators a lot. We're in a department/workspace where we're surrounded by all this information all the time. So we're very well read and up to date on this. But your average person probably does not know as much about pollination biology, or maybe they're just like, ew, bugs, or ew, wings and things, and I don't want that in my yard, and who cares? It's a plant that doesn't affect me, et cetera, et cetera. All things that we know are not necessarily true. But I want to go through, I just Googled basically pollinator myths or myths about bees, because most pollinators are bees, just generally speaking. Not saying the other ones aren't important, just saying many of them are.
That is fair.
But I just want to kind of run through this and talk about maybe the misconceptions or the new lines of thinking that people should have when they think about pollinators, because pollinators are really cool. And now that it's summertime, or almost officially summertime, you're going to see a lot of these things out. So this is just from a conservation board website, and just lists a couple different pollinator myths. And the first one that a lot of people have is, I don't want bees around in my yard because they will sting my kids or they will sting me. Why do we not, or why is this a wrong way of thinking, or a flawed way of thinking?
I have harassed bees in pretty much all the ways you can harass them.
Okay, and what ways are those?
Catching them in nets, grabbing them with tweezers, forceps, taking pictures of them, so following them around with a macro camera. And the only time I've had a bee sting me defensively is if I have accidentally grabbed it with my hand, or it's a bee that I've captured with tweezers, say in the lab, and it suddenly gets free and it's right next to me and it knows that I am the cause of its problems. But in terms of chasing them around with a camera, being in really close vicinity to them, they do not care unless you're like physically harming them or their nest. And most of the bees you're seeing in your flower garden don't have a nest like right there, which I'm sure Jeremy can comment on, like how far they go. So
Yeah, it can be a few hundred meters to a few kilometers at most. So your bee's not necessarily going on to the other side of, the country or the city, but there have been I have seen a couple of little studies where like bee flies across river, like large body of river. And it's like, oh, wow, I didn't think they needed to do that, but that's pretty impressive.
but if you see lots of bees in your garden, that doesn't mean there's a nest that you're going to accidentally step on.
There can be lots of visitors, even though they don't nest there.
Bees have much more important things to do than like really chase humans around or be aggressive. They've got priorities, and unless you're interfering with those priorities by like literally grabbing them and like actually trying to handle the bees, or being offensive to their like hive, even then, for beekeepers, if you're around them often enough, you can like tame beehives to the point where you can just kind of walk up to it, and you can get really close to beehives if you expose them to that often. It's different for wild things, or if you're being like mean to the bees, but they can be trained to accept a certain amount of harassment, I guess.
There's a kind of a fun St. Louis example for people that go to the St. Louis Zoo. There's a little pollinator garden right by the insectarium, and there's a wooden arbor that leads to this garden, and there's a little pathway that goes in a loop, so you have to go through the arbor. Carpenter bees breed in the arbor. And if you've ever seen a carpenter bee, they look like a giant bumblebee. They're massive, you can't miss them. And the male carpenter bees are a little bit territorial. They want to defend spots so they can find females that are coming in to visit wherever the wood, in this case the arbor. And I'll go in there and photograph, and I've seen many, many times, I'd love an undergraduate to do a research project on this, where families will start to go to the pollinator garden, they will encounter the carpenter bees under the arbor, and they do a U-turn. Because there's all these giant bees around the entrance.
Just hovering there.
And male carpenter bees, they can't sting at all. So that's something we could talk about, is male bees can't sting you at all. Yes. Same, I would presume, with male wasps and ants.
I don't know about wasps, but I know about bees.
Yeah, carpenter bee males will come stare at you. They'll get face to face and kind of look at you, and that really freaks people out. Stingers are modified ovipositors, so that's an organ for laying eggs. So that's why male bees, and I presume wasps and ants, also can't.
I did not know that.
Sting, yeah. So
interesting. I've had on the carpenter bees, I've had a maybe 1.5 inch long, like giant. They're like Xylocopa carpenter bees.
Yeah.
They're huge. They sound like a hummingbird, little drone. And I had one that I had it like land on my hand, and it was just like licking the salt off my hand. So once again, they're big enough that they have their own things to do. So normally you don't have to be too afraid of them.
Yeah, typically if you leave bees alone, they will leave you alone. Obviously, if you see like a nest and you're going up, like probably don't do that. But like usually if there's just bees visiting your flowers, they're there, they're getting their pollen, their nectar, and they're going to go about their way. And you can, like, I've walked up very close to bees and be able to watch them. They're just doing their thing, and they don't bother me. They just hang out.
I feel like the discussion is the only time it's really different is if you know that you have like a bee allergy. Like if you're gonna go into anaphylactic shock if you get stung, then you really should be careful. But if you know that you don't have that problem, like Becky, you've been stung many times by bees.
I know. I got one last week, I think. So now I'm in the double digits.
Yes.
So
A lab setting's a little different though than the listener who's probably gonna be outside seeing bees on flowers. Just for a caveat.
The only other person we keep a sting scoreboard. We also have lots of safety. So for
we're just described.
well, there's like 12 or 15 people on the board, and only 2 have stings.
Right.
And the person besides me has 1 sting. So I don't know. Maybe there's just something about me.
It's like it's not fun at all. Like it's an unpleasant experience, but it's not something to like shape your whole relationship with like a group of organisms around. Like,
And I would say again, most people are not studying bees in a lab. If you're outside just seeing pollinators, you'll be okay.
Yeah. I'm like harassing them. And then I've had a couple really unfortunate incidents in like I've been out doing field work, not even studying bees, and I took a bite of my sandwich and a bee landed on the sandwich right as I took a bite. So I have real bad luck.
Bee sandwiches. Don't recommend.
Don't eat the bees.
That is unfortunate. Okay, another myth. Bees are the only pollinators. I know we kind of hit this at the top of the show, but...
Yeah, flies are our unsung heroes, man.
Indeed. There's plenty of wasps that do pollination, like way fewer species than... The kind of same thing with all the other groups of insects, that there's like thousands or hundreds of thousands of species of those insects that do other stuff, but they're by proportion, most of them aren't pollinators, but there's still a bunch of species of wasps and beetles and stuff like that, you know, just by sheer numbers, there are a lot. There are a lot of weird other pollinators.
Indeed, yes, there is quite a group. Bees obviously are kind of the poster child for pollination, but there are lots of unsung heroes.
I feel like that's just because there's like almost no bees that do anything other than pollination.
Right.
Like there's only like a couple weird examples of bees that don't pollinate. So.
All right, next myth. I don't like healthy food, so I don't need pollinators. I'm a meat and potatoes guy, Sebastian. I don't need pollinators in these flowers. Get that out.
I feel like they made that one up. Who says that?
I mean, it's a myth that someone wrote on the internet. So
I feel like that's.
But again, someone may not realize the connection between pollination and food. So I think it's important to discuss.
I think this is like a second degree of like, but actually kind of information, which like. Unfortunately, that's kind of true. Like, if you do like meat and potatoes, you don't particularly have to be worried about the pollinators.
Contraire.
Yes.
Au contraire, please do tell.
This is the new thing. Everybody is familiar with the whole Save the Bees movement, which is, you know, we get to hear a lot about that, and I give them credit for being so successful with Save the Bees as like as a movement, but unfortunately. Most of our food staple crops are grasses and, you know, potatoes, which are produced by like they don't really need pollination to make potatoes. So, you know, if you enjoy like fruits and vegetables, that is what you would be deprived of if like pollinators all, you know, got wiped out.
I don't know a ton about it as an agricultural system, but in the United States, if you are eating beef, those beef at some point have probably eaten alfalfa. So a lot of feed that we give our meat animals, essentially, pollinators are going to be important for a big chunk of that too.
Mm-hmm. I don't know. I'm once again, I don't, not trying to be too contrarian here, but I feel like. The importance in the pollination is like, does the crop have to be pollinated to get the crop? And I feel like that's the difference between, apples or whatever, which if the orchard is not pollinated, you don't get apples, versus something where so long as you get the seed, you can just plant it and let
Well,
it
and I
grow.
think it depends on the feed if you're talking about meat, because if you're doing corn feeding or a whole host of other grains, it's the same thing you were saying. But I do think there are some staples. Alfalfa is jumping out at me, but I'd have to look it up, where I think we might have less meat production. Also, how do we make molasses? Because that's
Sugarcane.
going to be a lot of, that's a big grass,
Yeah.
isn't it? Yeah.
It's big grass.
So I do think we need it for certain meats. So you can't just discount and say,
Oh, yeah.
like,
This-
I eat meat. Forget the pollinators.
So, my point here is the kind of the pushback towards the middle of, first nobody cared about pollinators at all, and then we're like, our whole food system will collapse without pollinators, and like the data doesn't actually support that information. Like, they're important, and you wouldn't get like fruit if you didn't have pollinators. But once again, it's not as extreme as has been thrown out there by the save the bees kind of concept.
The page I'm looking at where I'm getting these myths just mentioned both chocolate and coffee beans need pollinators, as well as tea and tequila. So if
Yes,
those are
Yeah.
things you enjoy.
The things that truly matter in the
Yes.
world.
Coffee's a weird one because it's like one species of fly, and
Really?
they're not doing too hot, if I recall correctly. So yeah, if you like, even if you're a meat and potatoes person, I'm sure you like tomatoes on your hamburger, which are bumblebee pollinated. So I would like a diversity of food. I don't
Yes.
want to live in a dystopian future where I just can have potatoes and steak and no apples.
Yeah.
I think there was an episode, this is like towards the beginning when we started the show, where we talked about like fake meat. There was some fake meat story.
Yeah,
like they're
yeah.
making in the lab that we were talking about. I don't remember who it was or what it was. It was just like synthetic meat, and it just made me think of that.
I'll say that they actually just came out with a study on the lab grown meat. Given this is the very early in the lab grown meat industry, but they found that it's like so much worse than just growing a cow for the environment, because they're like all of the stuff that they have to do in the lab, they have to get like the highest grade lab materials in order to like culture these cells to make beef in the lab with, and that's like just so much more expensive than feeding a cow and worse for the environment. So
Jeez.
that may not pan out as far as an environmental solution to beef consumption.
All right, another myth. Most or all bees are honeybees. It's just the honeybees. There's no other kinds of bees.
No other bees.
You can take that one if you
Yeah.
want.
Are you sure, Jeremy? Do you
Go for
now
it.
want to go on a honeybee tirade?
No, I'll let you have it.
Okay. So honeybees are essentially at this point, they're not domestic in the sense of that like a dog is domestic, but they're domestic in the sense, I would say, similar to other livestock. So they've traveled around with people all over the world, and we love honey. We're good at growing bees. But essentially when you see honeybees around, that's like think of that like feral sheep or goats or feral pigs even. So we see all the save the bee stuff, and there's honeybee problems, but think of that more like a livestock problem than a bee problem. In the United States, we have many, many, many native bees that are solitary. They don't live in a colony at all or a hive. And then we've got many species of bumblebees that are pretty social. And what are some other really popular ones? Orchard bees would be good ones. Sweat bees.
Mason bees.
Yep. There are all the bees, and they're so cool. And some of them are beautiful if you stop and look at them. So that's my
Orchid
bee
bees.
friend.
Yeah, go. Everyone just needs to like Google orchid bees at some point in their life, because they're the coolest looking, like metallic green and blue things.
And
you've ever
oranges.
seen.
They've been transplanted to Florida too. So
Oh,
apparently
really? I
there's
didn't
parts
know
of
that.
Florida you can see them.
Interesting.
Yeah, I think before I joined this program, the only bees I were aware of were honeybees and bumblebees. And then since I joined the program, I was aware of so many other things. I didn't realize how much diversity there was with bees overall. It's quite crazy.
Cuckoo bees, mining
Cuckoo
bees.
bees. I don't like cuckoo bees because they look like the bee species I'm supposed to be finding in
Oh,
the
I know.
field. I know how to distinguish them now, but when I started, I was like, and I'm like, this looks off. I'm not sure why.
Yeah.
You're getting fooled by the exact same thing that the bees are intended
Yes.
to
Now
do.
I know. And now I'm like, that's a cuckoo bee. Just go away. But
And cuckoo bees are like their namesakes. They will find another bee nest and lay their own egg in there and either kick out or get rid of the owner's egg. So yeah, they behave like cuckoo birds.
all right, just a few more. So next myth, this is more about gardening overall, which is in support of pollinators. Native plant gardens are weedy and unruly. I don't like them. You guys do have more garden
Oh.
experience than I do, so.
And very different gardens.
Yeah.
I'd say we probably just shouldn't throw so much garden shade. Don't garden shame. That's, I think what I would say.
I agree. I definitely have a more traditional garden, just like in the stuff that I buy is more from the big box stores, and it's just less oriented for pollinators because I garden for me. That's I garden for the things that smell good to me and what I personally want to see. But you're a much better example of native plant gardening.
Native plant gardening in the St. Louis area is super fun because there's nurseries that carry a lot of native plants that haven't been doused with pesticides and things. But we also have these things called plant swaps, and there's usually some in the spring and some in the fall. So everyone brings their extra plants and you can take them. In terms of people worried about native plant gardens being weedy, that's actually what I love about them is that I can kind of set it and forget it. But I also did do a lot of garden design for my front pollinator garden. So I made sure I had tall species in the back, medium species in the middle, shorter species in the front, and I grouped like with like. So my garden actually does not look particularly unruly. So you can do just as much garden design with a native plant garden as you can with a traditional garden. There's also some tricks if you have a really aggressive plant, like I wanted something called an obedient plant, and everyone said, haha, it's not very obedient. So you can actually put that in a I know it's very corny, but you can put that in a container and still put that in the ground and mulch around that so it looks perfectly natural, but it can't send any root runners out, or at least not easily. So there's things you can do if you're worried about things getting weedy.
I feel like the unruliness or whatnot kind of just goes hand in hand with how much work are you willing to do to maintain it. Like any garden is going to look messier if you don't want to be out there kind of fiddling with it all the time. But I think the native plants have the benefit of if they are supposed to live in this area anyway. In theory, you can plant them and then not have to worry about them surviving. So you can let them do their thing, and that is just as valid a way of gardening as constantly going around and fiddling with stuff and touching it up.
I've properly watered my garden once this season. I've spot watered a couple new plants, but I haven't had to water the whole thing. All I need to do is weed every few weeks.
I have found it to be remarkable as desert dwellers.
Oh yeah.
It is insane how you don't have to water things here.
I tried to have a pollinator garden in Albuquerque, and I was excited to have one blanket flower make it. And if you haven't heard of blanket flower, it's like the easy mode of pollinator flowers. So it's hard.
So I have a general, this is me, Jeremy, now interjecting, not a myth person that I've been reading this phony voice. How much work do you have to put in for a pollinator garden? Is it more work than like your regular run-of-the-mill garden? Is it less work? Do you kind of sliding scale? Can you scale up or scale down? How's that? Like, I know nothing about this.
I'd say similar.
Mm-hmm. I'd say or less.
Or a little less,
I'd say probably less, mostly just because for the native plants, if they can fend for themselves, I feel like the idea of the pollinator garden is also like wildlife gardening of you don't want to keep everything super clean because you can leave sticks and seeds around for the birds and whatnot. So I feel like the pollinator wildlife garden is much more of just like let it do its thing. You weren't obliged to constantly be pruning everything and doing all that stuff. So I'd say easier.
Okay. All right. I think this will be the last myth we do. There's more, but I don't want to just read off myths all day. I think we're hitting on most of the big ones. last one we're going to talk about is we need to save the honeybee. This alludes to the Save the Bees movement that Sebastian mentioned earlier, which 9 times out of 10 in my experience, people are referring to honeybees, which if you know more about bee biology or just bees in general, as we've discussed, there's lots of types of bees who do lots of type of pollinator work, and it's not just the honeybee we need to be concerned about. I feel like now I'm going on a rant.
Go for it. It's your turn.
Two bee biologists. This is the bee controversy.
But the important thing, I guess, as part of this rant allegedly that I'm giving, is that honeybees are like the poster child for pollination. Everyone likes them because also they give us a product out of them. They give us honey, which people like to put on their toast and in their tea and all of that stuff. Bumblebees and lots of other bees don't necessarily do that. Bumblebees give you a little bit of honey, but it's very, very small amount, not enough that you really harvest to get anything out of. However, honeybees are not as good of pollinators as bumblebees and many other types of bees. So while they are more popular and more well known because, again, they give us honey and people having apiaries, that's where they wear the big white bee suits with the big bee boxes. That's all for the sake of getting honey and having colonies. But for the actual pollinators, bumblebees, mason bees, sweat bees, all those bees are doing a lot more of the heavy lifting in terms of the actual pollinator efforts. And they're the ones that are more in trouble. Thing I didn't know until I started the program is honeybees here are actually invasive. We don't actually have a native honeybee in North America. We used to, apparently thousands of years ago,
Really?
but it went extinct, so it's no longer around. And Apis mellifera, which is the honeybee that everyone knows, is what's here to stay. So,
As if someone had released, European chickens into the wild, and now they frolic in the fields.
Save the honeybee is a little bit like save the cows, like the free-range cows. I mean, they provide a service. We don't want all of them to die. Much of our agriculture industry is based on trucking colonies around that are rented. But again, think of it like managing a livestock resource as opposed to like saving a species.
Honeybees do not really have much to do with like pollination in nature. It's an industrial agriculture problem, and lots of people may have heard about the whole Save the Bees things from some documentaries and a lot of news coverage a while back. But the whole problem that started with Save the Bees was colony collapse disorder, which hasn't been a thing for like 10 years.
what is colony collapse disorder?
That
Sebastian?
is a very mysterious set of circumstances.
You don't even know what it is, do you?
No one. see that's the thing. That's the thing. No one figured out what colony collapse disorder was, and it just kind of went away. That was when if you've seen like a mountain of just burning beehives because they all just died for some reason, and people did not conclusively figure there wasn't a single cause. I think it was a bunch of contributing things that were causing like millions of beehives or honey beehives to die, and it kind of went away as quickly as it showed up, and that hasn't really been much of a problem. So the whole honeybees are going to go extinct thing just went away. That hasn't been a problem like it was in the past. So
To just define real quick, colony collapse is basically when a beehive or whatever insects, basically their colony just ceases to exist because they don't have the resources they need to survive. And it can happen allegedly for a number of reasons. They don't have enough food resources, they get infected, and everyone in the colony is infected with a parasite or a virus or whatever, and they die off. That's why it happens or why it's suspected to happen. The larger picture of how it fits into everything else is the mystery that Sebastian's alluding to.
Tell me if I'm wrong. I'm not a bee person.
I'm not sure about that, but I do think it's a good time to bring it back to save the bees for our native bees, like our bumblebees
Yes.
and mason bees and mining bees and leafcutter bees. I could list bees forever. Those are in trouble. So climate change, disease spread from captively reared bees, because you can get captive honeybees, you can order captive bumblebees now, though the manufacturers recommend that you keep them in greenhouses. But in the same way that we have to worry about disease spillover from, say, chicken farms to wild birds, we need to worry about that with bees too, with our captive bees. And then climate change as well, which I think I already said, as well as habitat loss. So if you make a pollinator garden, you're making a nice little habitat island. So our native bees are in trouble, and we do need to save those bees.
Yes.
The slogan is still true. It's just sort of redirecting that focus towards
Yeah.
broader than just honeybees.
Honeybees are fine. Worry about the other ones.
All right, so that's going to kind of wrap up our little myth section for part 2 of the show. For the last part of the show, we'll talk about promoting pollinators overall as citizens. So how can we be involved in our own efforts or in our communities as part of not just National Pollinator Week, but also just throughout the year when pollinators are abundant and helping them be supported so they can continue to reproduce for plants so they can survive, and they can also give us all the foodstuffs we love, like the tea and the tequila and the chocolate and the coffee and all that good stuff, and our fruits and vegetables we like, all that good stuff. So on the www.pollinator.org, there is the Pollinator Partnership Guide that has the Pollinator Week Toolkit. It has lots of activities and things to do. And Pollinator Week, I don't know if I mentioned at the top of the show, it's been around for about 15 years now. The Senate passed it in the mid-2000s to have a week designated as National Pollinator Week, which has been growing every year. But yeah, this packet has lots of activities that people can do. But before I kind of just dive in and like read off things from the packet, I just want to talk about like our experiences and like things that we could do as people to, not just as scientists, as citizens to promote pollinator awareness. This may vary based on your income, your assets, what you can do, how connected you are in your community, but I think in a way everyone can kind of help out. So what are our thoughts on this?
I think that the single most important thing people can support is just like habitat restoration work and like actual habitat management because bees exist in natural spaces. They also exist in like human spaces as well. But the best place for bees is in like intact natural habitat. And unfortunately, a lot of that habitat needs to be like first protected from like kind of problematic, I guess. I don't know, destruction, whatever in that ecosystem counts as being more degraded. But then it also has to be managed, such as light burnings and clearing out of invasive species and other plants that shouldn't be there. And I think once it's managed effectively, then it will be perfect pollinator habitat. And I think that is the best thing. That is what the bees would appreciate the most. But there are other things as well.
Yeah, I'd say if you're someone who lives in a rural area, you have even a small bit of land, usually your local agricultural extension offices as well as NRCS offices often have resources to help landowners with larger scale habitat. If you're like me, you live in an urban area, you can do a pollinator garden. So there's some bees that do really well in urban areas, and we've had people in our labs that have studied that, as well as at the botanical garden here in St. Louis. So there's certain bees that do really well in cities. So planting a pollinator garden, especially with native plants, because if we plant too many non-natives, I'm not going to garden shame. If you have some non-natives, do your thing. But sometimes if you have something that has so much nectar than any local plants, the bees don't visit the local plants and the flies don't visit the local plants. And if we want to have habitat restoration, we need our pollinators to visit our local native plants. So native plant gardening, native plant container gardening, removal of invasive plants, even in urban areas in St. Louis. You may have read about bush honeysuckle in particular. All those things are great. And if you live in an apartment, you can have a container garden. Those still are helpful. Attend educational events, donate, learn more about it, all kinds of good stuff.
Yeah, the one that came to mind, if you live in like a city and maybe you don't own property enough to like have a garden, is like if there's a community garden in the area or like some place you can volunteer at to support kind of local produce, because eating locally also is good for the environment overall. That also supports pollinators in that way as well. So it's kind of a good.
I feel like something I just thought of is, it doesn't work for bees, I guess. You have to provide them other stuff, but providing host plants, at least for butterflies. I know we kind of shamed on butterflies, but there's lots of flowers out there in the environment, but some animals need a really specific plant to actually grow the larva on and get the caterpillars going. So there's like a pipe vine plant that you can grow to have pipe vine swallowtail butterflies that only grow on that plant.
That's Dutchman's pipe vine. You can grow that locally.
yeah, you can grow those, and there's some native passion flower species that you can grow like a special. I don't
So
know.
if
Do you know the butterfly?
if
that
you
goes
play
in the-
Pokemon and you love Caterpie, the
Yes.
plant for you is the spice bush, and you can grow that here in Missouri. So spice bush swallowtails, they'll lay their egg, and when the caterpillars are very little, they look like bird poop. They'll still sort of stick out an organ that looks like a snake tongue. But once they go through a few instars, so as they grow and they molt and they shed their skin, they eventually look just like Caterpie, and they have eye spots. If you poke them a little bit, they secrete a smell, which to me smells very pleasant. It's very fruity. But they also inflate a little organ on their head that looks like a snake tongue. So, and that is the only reason I planted spice bushes on my property, and I totally got little Caterpies last year. Oh, the other thing you could do, which I totally forgot because I love the caterpillars, is be a little slightly obnoxious with your friends that talk about honeybees. Tell them about all the wonderful bees. Tell them about the flies. Tell them about the geckos and the birds and the bats. Don't let honeybees steal the glory.
Agreed.
Be the pollinator know-it-all of your friend group.
All right, so because many of these I would not have thought of, but just to read off things from the Pollinator Toolkit packet, these are ways that you can both be involved with Pollinator Week itself, but also just on a broader sense for promoting pollinators. So engage your government to sign a proclamation. That's a little more of a lofty, ambitious one for getting involved in policy, but that's still a great one. Display pollinator artwork and outreach materials in your office or place of work. So that's like an artsy kind of creative celebratory way. Join a social media campaign. Again, that's more of the policy side. For Pollinator Week itself, you can highlight Pollinator Week in newsletters so you can promote the awareness of the event overall, which is a good thing in and of itself. Sponsor Pollinator Week. So I know some cities and towns do have Pollinator Week events. St. Louis, I believe, does a fair amount of things with the Botanical Garden and other areas. Another one this is like an interesting one. Host a pollinator-themed meal or mixer. That's kind of cool. If I'm being honest, like a little like cocktail hour that's like pollinator themed. I think that's cool.
Okay, for our department, that would work quite
Yeah,
well.
we do good.
Yeah.
We can do that.
Host a planting day. So this is a good thing for if you're in a community like a school, office, local park, or library. Build native bee houses. This kind of goes in tandem with pollinator gardens, and you can also register your bee garden. Let's see other things. Plant native habitat that's promoting of bees. Other things you can do are host a nature walk or some kind of pollinator expert lecture. You would, of course, need some kind of pollinator experts to help you out with that. But that's a good thing if you have like a nature conservancy or a nature center and you know naturalists that'd like to do that. That's a cool thing to raise awareness or help even with like youth education. So you can get kids to be excited about pollinators. That's a good thing overall. Screen a pollinator film. I don't know of many of these, but
Yeah,
that seems like a awareness thing you could do.
Some good monarch ones.
oh yeah.
I don't know. I could think of a few, but I'd need time.
Okay, and then the last two are just host some kind of pollinator festival or a native plant sale. That's a good one. And then educational events at local areas like libraries, schools, etc. So yeah, lots of great ways to be involved with both National Pollinator Week and also just promoting pollinators at large. So as a reminder, Pollinator Week this year is June 19th through June 25th. That's a Monday through the following Sunday. Check your local area. If you're in St. Louis, there's lots of stuff going on around the city to promote pollinators. We also have lots of community gardens and ways to be involved with pollinators themselves. But as we wrap up, any last thoughts on pollination biology, pollinators, myths, ways to be involved in the community, any of those things?
I think, just staying aware, of course, even just on the plant side of the fact that, the plants can't move. They have to find something else to do all of this stuff for them. So the fact that you can be a pollinator, you can go around and cross-pollinate things in your yard, and, it's a whole field of, like, artificial hybridization, and, it is an activity that you can participate in if you feel like it. You can make your own kinds of like vegetables or flowers just by doing what bees do, but in a little bit more specific way.
I'd say watch the bees. They have a lot of really complex behavior. I've been watching a introduced European wool carder bee guard some of my flowers, and he smashes into the native bees and chases them away. He's very territorial. And they've evolved these like abdomen butt spikes to do that. So you can like hear him hitting other bees while he chases them away. So they do all these complicated things. Bees are really smart. I know I'm like harping on the bees here, even though we have all these other pollinators. And then one way to get introduced pretty easily, I thought of this while Jeremy was talking, is there is a really good documentary called My Garden of 1,000 Bees. Oh. It's a British filmmaker who decided to keep doing natural history documentaries during COVID by filming all the bees in his yard. And these are all solitary bees, the unique species that you don't get to see about. And I think it's on PBS, so I think you can just find it.
Oh, wait, I have seen this because I watched it during COVID.
Yep. So I'd say that's a really good one to get introduced to pollinators that you maybe haven't heard of.
Nice. Well, very cool. And that is going to wrap up our episode for this time. So thank you very much for listening for this episode. Thank you to Becky. Thank you to Sebastian. And special thank you to Ray for being awesome and bringing our podcast equipment. Yay, Ray! Yay. All right. We will be back later in the summer with another episode of That Science and Nature Show. But until then, my name is Jeremy Howard. You've been listening to our show, and we're out.